So the next section is going to be about testing. Now, when referring to testing, we're referring to processes or any way that we can test software to make sure that it meets the requirements for that software, or just to make sure that there are no bugs or that it just works in general, right? So does it do its job? And in general, does it like work? So the first type of testing is called static testing. Now, what we're doing here is we're examining documentation, specification, and test plans to make sure that the system that is being planned is the right system. So for example, let's say we want to do static testing on a piece of software that keeps track of patients in a hospital. Static testing would basically be verifying that even before we create the software, all of the plans for that software basically match what we want, right? So we have plans that take into account all the features and all of the requirements, all the tasks we want that software to be able to complete. Now, the term verification is synonymous with static testing because, again, we're verifying that our plans or our documentation matches our desired end product. The next type of testing is dynamic testing. Now, this testing takes place while the software is running and code is executed to make sure that code is executed during this type of testing, right? So what we're doing is we're making sure that the code produces the required result. Now, that might be the required user interface, or that might be the required output in terms of data. But basically, we're using code, we're writing code-based tests to make sure that the data output by the software is what we want. Or more specifically, software meets business requirements. Business requirements just being a term for the tasks that software should be able to accomplish. The term validation is synonymous with dynamic testing because we're basically validating that our software works as we want it to work. Next, we have alpha and beta testing, which are kind of in a different vein. So while previously we were talking about general, just types of testing, here we're focusing more on testing with relation to users. So basically what alpha testing does is alpha testing focuses on actually having members of the company or the team creating the software test the software and make sure that it functions as intended. So the big difference is that in alpha testing, we're basically having internal team members of the company making the software test the software. However, in beta testing, we're actually giving our software to a small group of intended end users. So we're taking some people who don't work at the company, who will most likely be users of our software, and we're giving the software to them, and we're going to see basically how easily they can use it, whether they find any bugs, and we're going to get feedback from them that we can use to improve or fix the software. So alpha testing, we have members of the internal team or company testing the software. Beta testing, we have a small group of future users or intended users testing the software to make sure everything that works the way it should, and to give feedback as to whether the software meets their needs or not. Yet another piece of software that let me rephrase that. Yet another type of testing is black box and white box testing. So again, we've had sort of some different themes in terms of testing, right? So with static and dynamic testing, we're really focusing on whether the software meets business requirements. With alpha and beta testing, we are focusing on the user reaction to the software. With black box and white box testing, we're kind of focusing on, I would say this is more similar. This is more focused on dynamic testing. So with black box testing, basically what we're doing is we are testing whether the software, whether the software itself does what we want to. So an example of black box testing would be someone let's say someone is black box testing Microsoft Word. They're basically going to use every feature of Microsoft Word and see whether all of those work and whether they meet the requirements for that given feature. So they're just using the software without seeing the code under the hood. Okay. This is also called functional testing, more commonly in the software development world. So basically, you're just using the software and making sure that it works in the way that it should. You are not looking at the code underneath, which is why it's called black box testing. It's just not it's not transparent in terms of seeing the underlying code. White box testing is the opposite. So this is going to be done by a software engineer, and usually white box testing is done using code. Now, what this is doing is this is actually testing the code itself underneath the software or inside the software to make sure that it works as intended. So black box testing is just testing whether the software works in a more non-technical manner, right? So it's meant to simulate a user testing the software. So you're just going to go through the user interface or whatever way there is of interacting with the software without writing code. White box testing, you're going in and you are testing the code, you're testing the internal structures and implementation of the software in order to make sure that it works as intended, often using methods like unit testing or integration testing, which again are the more commonly used terms in the software development world. And with black box testing, again, you don't need to know how the code works. With white box testing, you do need to have some knowledge of the code base. Now, another type of testing is called user acceptance testing. This is pretty simple. This is actually similar to beta testing. It's kind of just more broad term for when we have software tested by the intended audience. So basically give the software to people who we expect will use it, and we ask them whether it meets their expectations. Now, usability testing is another term you might see. This is just testing for how easy to use the software is.